Welcome to Festival of Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director, Festival of Ideas. We're talking today with Robert Reich, author of the new book, The System, Who Rigged It, How We Fix It. Robert is a columnist on The Guardian and Newsweek. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California in Berkeley. And he served 3 US administrations, most significantly as Secretary of Labour under President Clinton. His many other books include The Work of Nations, The Common Good, Saving Capitalism, which is also a film available on Netflix. I do urge you to visit Robert's website, robertreich.org, and to follow him on Twitter at @RBReich. Thank you very much for joining us, Robert. I thought we'd start by you talking a little bit about the last 40 years and the significant shift that's happened.
The biggest shift over the last 40 years, Andrew, is that wages for the typical worker in the United States have been flat, even though the economy in the United States has grown by more than doubling in size. Most of the gains have gone to people at the top. And with those income gains have also come wealth gains, and with that wealth has come power. Now, the situation in Britain and in other countries is similar, although not as extreme as in the United States. But you see, the undermining of democracy is the consequence of that kind of wealth gathered at the top. Not only is this has this made all of these economies more fragile, the United States economy more fragile than ever, as we see during the pandemic, but we also are having a crisis of democracy, which is in part Donald Trump, but also predates Donald Trump. In many ways, Donald Trump is the culmination rather than the cause of many of our, much of the undermining of the United States democracy.
Now, one of the things you've been very keen to stress is that we need to think systemically about this. Talk us through that a little bit about why we need to think of it in this way.
There is a temptation to blame particular people, like Donald Trump, for example, and assume that if those people simply were not elected or removed or moved on in some way, that the system itself would correct itself. And that's not the case. The political economic systems in which we are embedded have to be changed themselves if there is going to be fundamental change. The problem, as I see it, is not capitalism as we've come to understand it. Capitalism itself is a set of rules that vary dramatically according to time and place. That is, American capitalism 100 years ago was very different from American capitalism today. US capitalism is very different from Chinese capitalism. Even though China calls itself a communist country, it has private property, it has free exchange of goods and services, and so on. So the real question is what kind of capitalism? And I think that is the fundamental systemic question that needs to be addressed.
Now, I want to come on to some of the issues that you talk about, but the position we're in with this immense wealth concentration, where you've got the rich being able to buy their way into the colleges of their choice and get the health they want, and the rest can, everyone else has to pick up what's left. Really, this is unsustainable, isn't it? Though.
Well, it's completely unsustainable. From an economic standpoint, it's unsustainable because the rich don't spend very much of their income and wealth because they have so much. And an economy requires spending. In the United States, 70% of the economy really does turn on consumer spending. And if you have large numbers of people who have no money, you can't possibly have a sustainable economy. But you also have problems with democracy, with power. Democracy cannot function if it's overrun with big money. Just yesterday, for example, Jeff Bezos increased his fortune just in one day by $16 billion. Now, I don't have a calculator in my head. I can't calculate exactly what that comes to in pounds or in euros, but 16 billion is probably more than the United States spends on all of its low-income housing. It's more than we spend on food programs. That's one day for one man who has not only a great deal of wealth, but with that wealth comes a great deal of political influence. We can't even use antitrust law, anti-monopoly law against big companies and very wealthy aggregations of capital because of the politics and power that those aggregations have generated. And so that you see the self-fulfilling quality of all of this. As wealth and power accumulate at the top, it is possible for the wealthiest individuals and corporations to change the rules of the game, the rules of capitalism, to further enrich themselves, further entrench their wealth and power. And that's exactly what's been happening. And we see it accelerating over the last 10 or 15 years.
You might be pleased to know or not that the Bezos billions of additional wealth made quite big news over here as well. I didn't realize that there was the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, for example, that existed, but clearly it does, because that's where it was reported from here. When it comes to talking about, you talk about, we traditionally see politics as a party political divide, but you really focus on power, don't you? And it's not a left and right, Democratic and Republican. It's about power.
It's exactly. We don't talk enough about power, but in your country, in my country, we tend to fixate on the left versus the right. And traditionally, that debate has been about the size of government. The left says, well, we want a more robust, larger government, stronger safety nets, and the right says we want a smaller government. Actually, when you look at what's happened, particularly in the 21st century, the big divide is not between the putative left and right. The big divide is between democracy and oligarchy. That is, a few at the top who are aggregating more and more wealth and power, and a large number of people who no longer have very much say in our political systems.
I want to come back to oligarchy in a moment, but I wanted to just go through the three areas of systemic change that you talked about, and if you in the book, and if you could just elaborate on these a little bit. The first is the shift in corporate governance from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, in the United States, between the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the 1980s of Ronald Reagan, there was something that we now call stakeholder capitalism. It's a shorthand for understanding that the large corporation did not respond only to the needs of shareholders and demands of shareholders. The large corporation really did respond to the needs of its communities, where it was doing business, where it was founded, and also the needs of its workers. Labor unions became very powerful over that time, and government also was quite powerful in terms of representing the needs of communities and workers, so that there was a kind of a stakeholder dominant assumption about the purpose of the corporation. It was not just for shareholders. That changed in the 1980s in the United States when the corporate raiders, unfriendly takeovers, threatened almost all large American corporations. And the raiders themselves, who were equipped with so-called junk bonds, that is, high interest debt, they were able, because of changes in rules that they also engineered, to actually take over or threaten the takeover of big corporations unless those corporations maximize shareholder returns. And that's the key to it, because once you had that change in the dominant rule from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism, in which shareholders' interests and the dominant interests of maximizing shareholder returns became the center focus of corporations, then you were in an entirely different form of capitalism.
And at the same time, you had the growth of strengthening of middle class. You had political progress in certain areas.
Undoubtedly, and with stakeholder capitalism went the growth of the largest middle class in history, not only in the United States, but in post-war Britain, much of post-war Europe. You also had the very large growth. It was considered to be a huge success of capitalism. We avoided fascism, communism, avoided what a lot of people in the United States at the time thought was a form of socialism. We had socialism for the rich, but nobody paid much attention to that because the gap between the rich and the poor was not nearly as great. The typical CEO, Chief Executive Officer, was earning about 20 times the pay of the typical worker. Well, today, the typical CEO in the United States is earning close to 300 times the pay of the typical worker. Union membership has gone from 35% of the private sector workforce in the 1950s down to 6.4%. I mean, there's almost really no unionized sector left in the private sector of the United States. And that means workers have very, very little voice. Combined with this rise of shareholder capitalism, the net result is that democracy, not only in the workplace, but democracy overall, has been seriously undermined and compromised.
And that's the second shift, isn't it? The decline in large unions and I guess wider countervailing power and the growth of the giant corporations.
Yes, and it's important to understand that this is about power and bargaining power especially, because not only did you have a decline in unions, but you had an increase in the power of the largest corporations, a decrease in the use of anti-monopoly laws, and a centralization of economic power in very large corporations, which goes on to this day. In fact, every trend that I'm talking about is exemplified during the current pandemic, during the current economic crisis.
And then the third area of systemic change has been the sheer unleashing of the financial power of Wall Street.
Yes, after the great crash of 1929, in the United States, in Britain, in most other advanced countries, you had regulations and laws put in place that constrained finance. Many people saw 1929 as kind of symbolizing, and in fact, it was more than a symbol, it was the actual explosion of finance, and vowed never to allow that to happen again. Well, unfortunately, finance crawled back so that by the 1970s and 80s, we had a deregulation of finance in the United States, followed by Britain and to some extent elsewhere in Europe, so that by the time you get to 2008, the financial system again almost collapses, but the power in the financial system doesn't collapse. In fact, the biggest banks are now too big to fail, and they have huge financial and political power with regard to our democratic system.
In the book, you talk about two journeys you made. One, when you were Secretary of Labour, you went to various parts of the country and you realised then that people felt the system isn't working for them. When in 2015, you talked about going to similar places, some of the same, and actually meeting some of the same people and their adult children. And this time you found this anger and bitterness about the system and so on. And this is one of the results, isn't it? That the people feel not only the system isn't working for them, but they're now really angry about it and are prepared to put their vote sometimes in people like Donald Trump.
Yes, and I think that this explains largely Trump's triumph in 2016. It wasn't simply racism. I mean, the United States has had racism, and politicians have taken advantage of racism for many, many, many years. The real question that people ought to be asking about Trump's triumph in 2016 is why racism was such a powerful factor in 2016. And I think that what Trump managed to do, and he may tragically, he's certainly trying to do it right now. He may pull it off again in this coming election. But he used the anger of the working class and channeled it into not only racism, but also xenophobia and misogyny. That is, he as demagogues have used historically, has used the anxieties of the working class to promote himself and his political party through hatefulness. I mean, let's be quite candid about it. There's no question. Donald Trump is trying to do that again. I mean, he botched the pandemic. He created in the United States really the worst public health crisis since 1918 in America, the great pandemic of 1918. But he doesn't want Americans to understand how badly he and his administration have done. We have now in the United States around 135,000 deaths because of, largely because of Donald Trump. I mean, not entirely, of course. We didn't have a public health system that was up to dealing with the crisis, but Donald Trump and his administration refused to take responsibility. They left it to the states. There was a haphazard response. There still is. He would like people to disregard that. He'd like to deflect the public's attention onto essentially a racist law and order campaign. And he is, as we speak, he's trying to foment confrontations in the nation's cities by sending in federal troops. Not from the Department of Defense, not military troops, but a kind of a paramilitary operation. Now, I don't want to get too far off the themes of the book, Andrew, but these are exactly what I was predicting and concerned about in the book. Donald Trump is sort of the culmination of many of the trends that I talked about, and I talk about in the book.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the book, I mean, America's been in this position before with oligarchic rule and so on. You talk about, you know, the first period of the slave-owning families and so on, but particularly the Gilded Age and the Progressive era. And, you know, then you had, you know, presidents who took on big business. You had Susan B. Anthony and the suffragette movement. You had Jane Addams on public health, Mother Jones on the unions, and William Jennings Bryan. I mean, one of the things we've been very keen to investigate in our work is about what are the solutions to the issues we face. And do you feel that one of them is having the right people around to help take this forward? Do you feel now we have the right people to help move this forward politically, in social movements, in political movements, in campaigns and so on?
Well, we're at least in the United States, we are potentially there. Let's put it this way. Donald Trump has pulled off something that no president in recent memory has managed to do, and that is create a very strong coalition, an alliance that is multiracial, multi-class, and indeed, to a large extent, bipartisan, because there are many Republicans who have joined this coalition. But unfortunately for Trump, this is a coalition against him, against his reelection. And it is possible, in my optimistic moments, I like to think that this coalition, this biracial, multi-class, bipartisan coalition, could not only get him out of office November 3rd, Election Day, but also push the United States and push Joe Biden, if he is elected, to a new progressive era.
So some of the things you talk about in the book, you throughout the book, you give almost like a program for change as you go through, and talk about some of those, you know, so cleaning up politics, you know, getting the big money out of politics and stopping voter suppression are two key areas that are essential, aren't they?
They're very essential because, you see, without a fully functioning, robust democracy, all of the other proposals, whether it's climate change or redistribution or cleaning up making the market, the capitalist market work for everybody, all of those are pipe dreams. You have to start with getting a democracy that is working for the many rather than the few. And that requires fundamental reform of a sort that I talk about in the book, getting big money out of politics and also ending voter suppression, making sure that people are able to vote and vote easily.
What are your proposals for cleaning up business?
Essentially, what we need to do is, in terms of how to get big money out of politics, we need to go back to where we were before the Supreme Court uh, essentially said that corporations are people, and before that, the Supreme Court said that money is the equivalent of speech. Well, obviously, that's both of those propositions are rubbish, and it is possible through a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court. It's possible through the appointment of better Supreme Court justices who understand the necessity of getting big money out of politics, that this could be reversed. But there are many other things that can be done, and I don't want to bore you or your viewers, but I go through some of them, and I think that they're equally applicable to Britain and elsewhere. For example, getting rid of the revolving door. We have too many people who move in and out of government from the private sector and into positions where they can influence government policy over the very industries that they were involved with. Well, that's absurd, and that's not only a bad policy, but that actually rigs the game against people who are concerned about the social costs of private capitalism.
One I was particularly intrigued by, because it's a problem here as well, is where you've got a particular community that has a company or a corporation that's been associated with that community for a long time. I mean, we're in Bristol in England, where you've got, you know, major aerospace companies, you had tobacco companies who were actually quite good employers in many ways, you know, introducing pensions and social clubs and paying people decently in most cases. One of the things you mentioned is giving communities a say whether existing corporations should be allowed to abandon the place that they've made their home and got their wealth from. And I thought that was very, very interesting.
Well, exactly, because you see, places, neighborhoods, communities, cities do invest in these companies. They are not financial investors per se, but they are investors in terms of infrastructure and human capital and all sorts of social benefits and social goods. So that every place that has a business in it should have some say, particularly if they are large businesses, over what the business decides to do in terms of, for example, abandoning a community. The social costs involved in community abandonment are and can be exorbitant. And we've seen that across Britain, we've seen it across the United States. Much of the angry working class in America is angry because so many big companies have abandoned the places where those workers for generations and have invested their time and their energies and their lives.
Now, one of the big pushes of change, of course, are new politicians going into Congress. And there's been some very interesting politicians, you talk about them in the book, elected recently with new ideas, you know, Green New Deal being one of those. Do you see hope in those as part of the coalition for change that you're calling for?
Yes, I do. In the 2018 midterm elections, we had an uprising, an upwelling of young people, particularly, and people of color, who got into politics for the first time and changed the movement of American politics. I mean, essentially enabled the Democrats to take over the House of Representatives. We had more young people as a percentage of the population voting than ever before. And if that trend continues in 2020, we will see possibly even the Democrats taking over the Senate. But I want to emphasize it's not just the Democratic Party. It's a different kind of Democratic Party. It's a Democratic Party that is much closer to people of color, to women, to people who have not for many, many years had a voice, if ever, in American politics. And this is very exciting. I think that when I am optimistic about this country, I look at what happened in the 2018 midterms. I look at young people who I have taught for 40 years. I've never had the privilege of dealing with a generation of young people who are as committed to positive social change and social justice as the generation I'm teaching right now. That also gives me a lot of optimism.
I wanted to ask you two other areas. The book is, you're very critical of corporate social responsibility, and I think I've been critical of that myself, and though I've been a small beneficiary of companies giving little bits of support to areas, as this is one of the areas where they feel that they are contributing to society. Well, what is the problem with that?
Well, it's all public relations. It is they give the minimum to boost their brand image. And that is not irrational from their standpoint. If they're trying to maximize shareholder returns, that's what they would do. But part of their agenda is to stave off any laws or regulations that really do codify some very, very important principles and changes in corporate behavior, such as environmental protection. You see, there are bits and pieces of doing good. If it has the result of preventing the public from understanding the importance of fundamental change in laws and rules and regulations, then they are not doing good. Actually, they are doing bad because they're preventing the kinds of changes from occurring that need to occur.
And you bookend the system with a letter to the head of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon. Why did you do that?
Well, the book actually began with a call from Jamie Dimon a couple of years ago to me. He was concerned about something that I had written. He was very sensitive. He is very thin-skinned. And I thought it was interesting how defensive he was. And so in that phone call, I started to argue with him, but obviously in one phone call, you can't get very much of your argument in. But I ruminated about this for about a year, and I thought Jamie Dimon would be a good foil for the book, not because he himself is in any way a bad person. In fact, just the opposite. He is one of the most responsible CEOs in America. He is a Democrat, calls himself a Democrat, says he is a patriot first. But because of the system, and this is why I call the book The System, he is locked into a kind of a set of incentives, of processes, of laws, of inducements that make him behave in a certain way. He cannot really fundamentally change the system, doesn't want to change the system. In fact, his responsibility as the CEO of the biggest bank in America is to fight fundamental changes in the system. And that's what I want to get across. If he and other CEOs like him really did care about social justice, about environmental decay, about any of the things they talk about, they would either get out of the way and stop lobbying in exactly the opposite direction, or they would use their lobbying might to fundamentally reform, change the system in the direction that they talk about. But they won't do that, obviously. That's not in their interest. It's not in the interest of their shareholders. Has
he responded to the book in any way? Have you spoken to him?
I have not spoken to him. He's not called me. I'm not waiting by the phone for his phone call. But again, my purpose is not to change his mind. His mind probably won't be changed, nor will any other CEO in America. My purpose is really to educate the public about the system so that some of the green shoots that we are now seeing, starting with the midterms of 2018, can hopefully, with the election of Joe Biden, take deeper root.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's a wonderful book. It's one that we're going to be debating a lot over the next few years, because the lessons are equally transferable to this country as they are of use in the United States. I want to thank Picador and Anna Pillai in particular for supporting this event and arranging for Robert to join us. I do urge you to buy The System. If you want to buy a copy, it's available from our partners at Waterstones, online and in store, now the bookshops are open again here. Our series on the future of democracy continues through the summer and into the autumn. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you most of all, Robert Reich. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye-bye.